One of the best things about literature is that it can enable and support the development of empathy. That is, in literature, we can listen to and learn from stories and experiences that are not our own. And that has a lifelong value, and perhaps is the whole reason that we tell stories to begin with. But moving on from that sort of existential question, let's look at Grace Lin's blog about Tiki Tiki Tembo. Grace Lin is an Asian American author with a multi-ethnic background who writes Asian American multi-ethnic children's lit. And she reflects in this blog just on her personal experience with Tiki Tiki Tembo in her kids' school. And she does an excellent job of looking at the long history and the sort of evolution of what this tale has meant in children's lit in English in this country. And for me, this really hit home because as a kid in the 1980s, I really enjoyed this story. But when I came back to it as a professor teaching children's lit, I saw how problematic it was. And then when I read this blog, I was like, oh, my experience makes a lot more sense. Because, just as Grace Lin pointed out, in the 1980s at my public library, which was not well funded, there was not a lot of representation of diversity, and there just was not in kids lit in English at that time. And so anything that seemed to represent diversity was very welcome. However, now there are so many other choices by own voice authors, that is, authors who identify with the characters that they are representing. And they can give more authentic, more accurate, richer representations of the cultures with which they identify. And so, thinking about that evolution, I want everyone here to, one, read this blog, read one of these stories, and think about the history that Grace Lin brings up, including the fact that this is not a Chinese story as it's being represented. This is most likely a Japanese story, a traditional Japanese story that was stereotypically representing Chinese identity in its construction of its mythology. So, another thing to think about if we look at the ECL in Chapter 5 is that we see this pictograph. How does this pictograph resonate with what Grace Lin says about kids lit in the United States? And, on that note, move on to A Big Mooncake for Little Star. This is a story, a fantastic story that has been written by Grace Lin for her kids. It's a story she's entirely made up. It's not from any kind of mythology, although her stories are informed by Chinese mythology, Chinese American mythology, and her own experiences with literature as a kid. And so she writes a story, A Big Mooncake for Little Star. And this book is actually banned because it was on a list for teachers interested in sharing text about diverse characters in their classes. If you're interested in that history, it's here. This is something that if you ever want to explore it in, say, a final project on banned book for kids, this would be an interesting place to go. And as you're looking at this book and at Tiki Tiki Tembo, think about things like illustrations, language, and cultural representation. Who is depicted? How are they depicted? How do the artists who create these, their language or the images, identify? These are all important questions that we will be addressing in our final discussion question this week.